The town of Dry Creek had always been a place of arrivals and departures, its single-train line carved across the endless prairie like a scar upon the land, bringing strangers and taking neighbors, leaving behind stories that often became gossip before the day was done. The depot sat at the edge of town, a wooden platform baked by sun in summer and swept by icy winds in winter. That morning, however, it bore witness to something more fragile than freight or timetables, a young woman's hope. Eleanor Grace stepped off the train with a worn leather suitcase in her hand and a trembling in her chest that matched the rhythm of the departing locomotive. She paused at the platform, her pale fingers tightening on the handle of her case, and lifted her chin as if willing courage into herself. She wore her best dress, light blue, carefully pressed though faded at the seams. A bonnet shaded her face, but no fabric could hide the truth she carried. The right side of her face bore the mark of a childhood fire, skin uneven, one brow shortened, the faint tightening of flesh across her cheek and jaw. It was not grotesque, but it was visible, undeniable. A stranger might have looked quickly away, then forced themselves to look again out of curiosity or pity. Eleanor had lived long enough to recognize both reactions. And yet, she had chosen this journey because a man named Thomas Beringer had written her letters, filled with promises of acceptance and a future together on his farm. His words had made her believe in possibility again. Her heart swelled with nervous anticipation as she scanned the crowd. Cowboys lounged against posts, townsfolk bustled with packages, and children darted between skirts and boots. Then she saw him. A tall man in a dark vest and hat stood a few paces away, a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in his hand. Her breath caught Thomas. She recognized him from the photograph he had once sent, his jaw square, his posture proud. For a heartbeat, joy bloomed in her chest. But as his eyes fell upon her, the flowers slipped slightly in his grip. His smile faltered, then died. Eleanor's steps slowed, then stopped altogether. She could see it, the flicker of disappointment, the tightening of his mouth. The crowd seemed to hush, though in truth it only grew louder, the clatter of boots and murmur of voices pressing against her ears. "You're Eleanor?" Thomas's voice was flat, edged with disbelief. "Yes," she whispered, forcing steadiness. I came just as we planned." His gaze swept her face, lingering on the scar, and something in him hardened. "The letters didn't mention this," he muttered, the words falling like stones into the dust between them. "You should have told me." Shame burned her skin hotter than any flame had years ago. I thought you might see me for more than." He cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "I can't do this. I won't." He shoved the flowers into the hands of a passing boy, turned on his heel, and walked away without another word. The sound of his boots striking the platform echoed louder than the departing train whistle. Eleanor stood rooted, her suitcase heavy at her side, her throat tight with unshed tears. Conversation stirred around her like dry leaves in the wind. She caught fragments. "Poor thing left at the station. Didn't take him long, did it?" Some faces turned away in awkward sympathy. Others lingered in cruel curiosity. Eleanor wanted nothing more than to vanish, to dissolve into the dust and sunlight, and leave no trace. Her whole body ached with humiliation. She forced herself to move, each step toward the edge of the platform heavy with the weight of rejection. The train that had carried her hope away shrank on the horizon, and she felt as though it had taken her very breath with it. She sank onto a bench, clutching her case to her chest like a shield. Questions battered her mind. Should she buy a ticket back east, return to the town where whispers had driven her away? Should she try to find work here, in a place where her first moments had been marked by public disgrace? Her heart pounded, her stomach churned, and then she felt it. A gaze, steady, unflinching. Not the fleeting glance of pity, not the darting curiosity of children, but something different. She lifted her eyes. A man stood apart from the others, leaning against the hitching rail. His hat cast a shadow across his brow, but not enough to hide the scar running along his jaw, nor the stiffness in his posture, as though his right leg bore an old injury. His clothes were plain, dusted from the trail, yet he carried himself with a quiet dignity. Unlike the others, he did not look away when their eyes met. Instead, he tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of respect, as if acknowledging her worth in a way Thomas never had. For an instant, Eleanor's breath caught again, not with hope exactly, but with the faintest spark of recognition. This man, too, bore marks of battle survived. The train whistle was gone. The crowd moved on, but Eleanor felt the world narrow to that simple moment, her shame colliding with his steady regard. She could not yet know his name, nor the role he would come to play in her life. But deep inside, something shifted, a whisper of possibility, faint but undeniable. The day had begun with hope, crumbled into humiliation, and now teetered on the edge of something unexpected. Eleanor held her suitcase tighter, straightened her spine, and drew a breath that tasted of dust and courage. For in the silent gaze of a scarred cowboy, she had glimpsed the chance that her story was not yet over. The crowd at the station slowly dispersed, leaving Eleanor on the weathered bench with her suitcase and her shame. She traced the grain of the wood with her fingertips, avoiding the curious stares that still lingered from a few passers-by. Her heart still thudded painfully, each beat echoing the words Thomas had left her with. "I can't do this." Her mind spiraled into dread. She had no home here, no kinfolk, and the little money she carried was meant to begin a married life, not sustain a solitary one. Yet to turn back east would mean returning to the same small town that had whispered about her behind closed doors. Both choices felt unbearable, and the weight of them pressed on her chest until she could scarcely draw a breath. A shadow fell across her. At first, she thought another curious onlooker had come to gawk, and her shoulders stiffened. But when she lifted her eyes, she found the man from the hitching rail standing before her. He was taller up close, his frame broad beneath his trail-worn shirt. A scar ran jagged along his jaw, disappearing beneath a week's worth of stubble, and his right hand, gloveless, bore the twisted mark of an old burn or wound. He held himself with quiet steadiness, leaning slightly on a cane. His weight shifted carefully to his left leg. His eyes, a muted gray, studied her not with pity, but with a depth that unsettled her. "Miss," he said, his voice low, warm, and even, "you look like you could use a hand." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of his words. "I am fine," she stammered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. He glanced at her suitcase, still clutched to her chest, as though it were a shield. "Don't look fine," he said gently. "You look like someone the train carried in but forgot to carry home." The honesty startled her. No stranger had ever spoken to her scars so directly, not with cruelty, not with false kindness, but with plain truth. She felt her throat tighten, uncertain how to respond. The man reached down, his hand rough and scarred, yet careful as he gestured to the suitcase. "Let me carry that for you. There's no sense you sitting here in the dust all day." She hesitated, clutching the case tighter. Trust did not come easily, not after the rejection she had just endured, not after years of guarded glances. But something in his expression urged her to relent, a steadiness that seemed unshakable. Slowly, she allowed him to take the suitcase. "Thank you," she murmured. He tipped his hat. "Name's Caleb Turner. Got a ranch not far from town. Place is more work than one man can manage these days. House is too quiet besides. I reckon you might be needing work, and I might be needing help." Eleanor stiffened. "You don't even know me." Caleb studied her with a gaze that felt as though it looked beyond her scars. "I know you're strong enough to ride this far alone. I know you've been dealt an unfair hand and still stood up straight when the world tried to bow you low. That's enough for me to know you can cook a meal and keep a house running." His words, spoken without hesitation, struck something deep inside her. Strength? She had never thought of herself that way. She thought only of surviving, of enduring. Yet in his voice, strength sounded like dignity, like honor. Still, mistrust tugged at her. "Why are you offering this?" "Out of pity." Caleb's jaw tightened, and his scar caught the light of the afternoon sun. "No, ma'am. I've had enough pity to know I wouldn't wish it on anyone. This isn't pity. It's recognizing someone who deserves better than what she was given this morning." Her cheeks warmed, and for a moment she had no words. She studied him, noting the limp, the scar, the gravity in his eyes. He, too, carried wounds that the world judged before it understood. "I can cook," she said at last, her voice steadier now, "and clean and mend. I'm not afraid of work." "Then we understand each other," Caleb replied simply. "Come on. Sun will be setting soon. Best to reach the ranch before dark." He offered his arm. Eleanor hesitated, then placed her hand lightly upon it, surprised at the firmness of his strength despite the limp in his gait. Together they walked from the station, the townsfolk's whispers fading behind them. The road to his ranch stretched wide beneath the fading sky. Prairie grass swayed in the breeze, and the mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks catching the last gold of sunlight. Silence lingered between them, but it was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of two people who had known loneliness too long to fear it in another. At last, Caleb broke it. "Letters can lie," he said quietly, "but scars tell the truth." Eleanor turned her head toward him, startled by the bluntness, yet drawn to the sincerity in his tone. "And what truth do mine tell you?" He looked at her then, his gray eyes steady and unflinching. "That you've lived through fire and still stand. That you're stronger than most men I know. And that beauty isn't lost just because the world refuses to see it." The words pierced her heart, not with pain but with a kind of balm she had never known. Her eyes stung, and she looked away quickly, not trusting her composure. But the corners of her mouth trembled with something dangerously close to hope. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had fallen, painting the horizon in deep purples and golds. The house was modest but sturdy, with a barn nearby and fields stretching wide. Caleb set her suitcase on the porch, then turned to her with the same steady calm. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said. "If it works out, maybe longer. You've got nothing to prove, Eleanor. You're already enough." Her breath caught again at the sound of her name on his lips, spoken not with scorn, not with hesitation, but with quiet respect. For the first time since the station, Eleanor felt the crushing weight of rejection lift, if only a little. She stepped into the house, carrying with her not just her belongings, but the fragile beginnings of something she had thought forever lost, the chance to be seen, not as broken, but as whole. And as she crossed the threshold, she knew this was no ending but a beginning, though what it would demand of her heart, she could not yet know. The days at Caleb's ranch began with the crow of a rooster and the thin light of dawn spilling across the plains. Eleanor quickly fell into a rhythm, cooking hearty breakfasts, scrubbing floors, and hanging laundry in the clean prairie air. With every task, she felt her hands reclaim a sense of purpose. The work was simple, yet it offered dignity, something she had been stripped of at the station. Still, the memory of humiliation clung to her like smoke. Each time she caught her reflection in the window pane, she heard Thomas's voice echoing, "I can't do this." Some wounds refused to fade, and though Caleb's presence was steady, Eleanor could not silence the whisper that perhaps his kindness, too, was fragile, something that might crumble once he saw her as others did. Caleb himself carried burdens unspoken. His limp worsened after long hours in the saddle, and though he never complained, Eleanor noticed the way his jaw tightened when the pain flared. Sometimes she caught him staring out over the fields, his gray eyes distant, as though measuring what was lost against what little he had left. She longed to ask, but respect kept her silent. The first test of their fragile companionship came with the arrival of townsfolk. Caleb, despite his reserved nature, was respected as a landowner. Word had already reached town of the scarred woman who had been left at the station but now kept house for him. Whispers followed them when they rode in for supplies. Eleanor felt them like needles against her skin. "Is that her?" a woman muttered outside the mercantile, her tone sharpened with disdain. "The one he took in." "She'll bring him nothing but shame," another replied, shaking her head. "Two broken souls don't make a whole." Eleanor's hands trembled as she counted coins at the counter. Caleb, standing beside her, heard the whispers as clearly as she did, but his expression did not waver. When they stepped outside, however, she stopped him, her voice barely steady. "Why don't you tell them the truth?" she asked. He frowned. "And what truth would you have me tell?" "That I was abandoned, that I was never wanted, that I am nothing more than a burden you pitted enough to carry." His gaze snapped to hers, sharp with quiet fury. "Don't you dare call yourself a burden." Her breath caught. The conviction in his tone left no room for argument, yet doubt gnawed at her. Could a man as scarred as Caleb truly see her as more than a shadow of pity? Conflict deepened that evening. At supper, Eleanor placed a bowl of stew on the table and finally asked the question that had haunted her since she first stepped into his home. "What happened to you, Caleb? The limp, the scar. Why carry your pain alone?" Silence filled the room. For a long moment he did not answer, only stared into the fire. At last his voice emerged, roughened by memory. "War happened," he said simply. "I rode out thinking bravery would make me a hero. Came back half a man and no hero at all. Folks didn't welcome soldiers scarred and broken. They wanted parades, not reminders of what fighting cost. So I kept to myself, built this ranch, lived quiet, safer that way." Eleanor's chest tightened. His wounds mirrored her own in a way she had not expected. Not fire, not betrayal, but the same cruel judgment of a world that turned away from scars. "You're not half a man," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're stronger than anyone I've known." His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of kinship, of two souls marked yet unbowed. But before it could deepen, he broke the gaze, returning to his stew with a measured calm. The transformation, however, began in small acts. Eleanor discovered that Caleb's stoicism hid a generosity as vast as the prairie. When a neighbor's child fell ill, Caleb rode through the night to fetch medicine, returning with exhaustion etched into his features, but relief in his eyes. When storms threatened the crops, he worked through the rain, stubbornly refusing to yield. Eleanor found herself drawn to this resilience, her admiration growing even as her doubts battled within her. She, too, began to transform. One afternoon, she caught her reflection in the well's water. For the first time in years, she did not flinch. The scar was still there, etched across her cheek, but her eyes, once hollow, now carried a light she had thought extinguished. She realized it was not beauty she had been deprived of, but the courage to see herself beyond the wound. Caleb had given her that, though he did not know it. Yet conflict came again, sharper this time. One evening, Thomas returned. The man who had abandoned her at the station rode up to the ranch, shame flickering in his posture, but entitlement in his words. "Eleanor," he said, dismounting, "I was a fool. I see now I was wrong. Come back with me. We can start fresh." The sight of him reopened every wound she had buried. Caleb stood beside her, silent but solid, his presence like a shield. Eleanor's heart pounded. The easy choice would be to run back, to grasp at the life she had once dreamed of. But as she looked at Thomas, she saw not salvation but weakness, a man who had abandoned her at her most vulnerable. She drew a breath, steadying herself. "You left me," she said, her voice clear, "and in leaving, you showed me who you truly are. I am not yours to claim. Not now. Not ever." Thomas paled, stammered, then mounted his horse and rode away, the dust of his departure fading into the horizon. Eleanor's knees trembled, but she did not fall. She turned to Caleb, who studied her with quiet pride. For the first time, she realized the transformation was complete, not because someone called her beautiful, but because she had claimed her own worth. Caleb tipped his hat, a small smile touching his scarred face. "That took courage, Eleanor. More courage than most men muster in a lifetime." Her heart swelled, not with dependency, but with strength. She was no longer the abandoned bride at the station. She was a woman reborn in fire, standing firm beside a man who carried scars as she did, neither diminished, both transformed. And as the stars began to prick the night sky above the ranch, Eleanor felt something stirred deep within her, not just survival, but the fragile, enduring bloom of hope. The morning after Thomas's departure, the ranch seemed washed clean. Rain had fallen in the night, leaving the fields glistening, each blade of grass jeweled with dew. The air smelled of renewal, earthy, crisp, alive. For Eleanor, it felt as though the land itself recognized her choice, her courage to turn away from a past that had once bound her. She stepped outside with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The sun crested the horizon, flooding the prairie with light that touched everything in gold. She paused, breathing deeply, and for the first time in years, she felt no shadow of shame pressing down upon her. Her scar was still there, unchanged, but it no longer defined her. She had faced Thomas. She had faced herself, and she had chosen to live forward. Caleb appeared from the barn, brushing hay from his hands. His limp slowed him, but his movements carried quiet strength. He caught sight of Eleanor standing by the fence, her hair loose, her eyes distant yet peaceful. Something in her posture had changed, something subtle but undeniable. She was no longer the trembling woman he had met at the station. "You look different," he said simply, his voice low but steady. Eleanor turned toward him, a small smile lifting her lips. "Maybe I finally see myself the way you did all along." For a moment, silence lingered, but it was no longer heavy. It was tender, filled with unspoken understanding. Caleb tipped his hat, almost shyly, as though words could not capture what his heart already knew. Life on the ranch unfolded into a new season. Eleanor embraced the rhythm with growing confidence, mending shirts, cooking meals, tending the small garden she planted by the cabin. Cowboys who had once eyed her with curiosity now respected her, not out of pity, but because they witnessed her resilience day after day. She was not just a scarred woman. She was the heart of the household, the one who made the ranch feel like home. Yet the most profound change was within herself. She no longer avoided mirrors. Instead, she began to braid her hair in the mornings, her reflection no longer an enemy, but a companion. When she smiled at her own image, she realized she had become the woman she once longed to be, not flawless, but whole. Caleb, too, softened. The walls he had built around himself began to crumble in small, meaningful ways. He laughed more, not often, but enough to light the room. Sometimes Eleanor caught him watching her as she worked, his gaze not of pity, but of reverence. It was in these moments she understood. He had not rescued her. They had rescued each other. Their bond deepened in unspoken gestures. On long rides across the ranch, they rode side by side, the silence between them comfortable, filled with trust. On stormy nights, when thunder rattled the windows, Caleb would sit near the fire, telling her stories of his youth, of dreams lost and lessons earned. She listened not as an outsider, but as someone who shared in his scars, each story weaving them closer together. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and painted the sky in crimson and gold, Caleb brought Eleanor to a small hill overlooking the ranch. He leaned on his cane, the effort clear, but his eyes burned with quiet determination. "I built this place to be alone," he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "Thought it was safer that way. No one to judge, no one to disappoint. But you've made it into something more. You've turned it into a home." Eleanor's throat tightened. "And you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, dignity. A chance to stand tall again." He looked at her then, his scarred face illuminated by the fading light, and for the first time, he did not hide. "Eleanor, you are beautiful, not because of what others see, but because of the strength you carry. The world may never understand scars, but I do, and I wouldn't trade mine, or yours, for anything." Tears pricked her eyes, but they were not born of sorrow. They were cleansing, tender, real. She reached for his hand, rough and calloused, and laced her fingers through his. Together they stood, gazing out at the land, two scarred souls no longer diminished, but made whole by the courage to love again. From that day forward, their partnership blossomed. They worked side by side, building not just fences and barns, but a life stitched with respect and devotion. Neighbors who once whispered behind their backs began to admire their union. Some even envied it, for in a world obsessed with perfection, Eleanor and Caleb had discovered something rare: authenticity. The moral of their story stretched far beyond the ranch. It whispered through the prairie winds, carried in the laughter of cowboys who now saw beyond appearances, and in the strength of a woman who refused to be defined by her scars. True beauty, they had learned, was not skin deep but soul deep. It lay in resilience, in the courage to face rejection and rise again, and in the quiet power of kindness that dared to call the broken beautiful. As years passed, The ranch flourished, but more importantly, so did their hearts. On anniversaries of that fateful day at the station, Eleanor sometimes returned in thought, remembering the moment she had been left behind. What had once been the day of her greatest shame became instead the day she found her greatest blessing. For without abandonment, she would never have met Caleb. Without rejection, she would never have discovered her own strength. And without scars, both his and hers, they might never have recognized the beauty in each other's brokenness. On one quiet evening, as stars scattered across the velvet sky, Eleanor sat on the porch with Caleb at her side. The cicadas hummed, the ranch animals settled, and the night wrapped around them like a prayer. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were left behind," she said, "but maybe that's what it took to find where we truly belong." Caleb tightened his hand around hers, his answer simple but profound. "Sometimes the world's cruelty leads us straight to grace." And with that truth, their story closed not with tragedy, but with triumph, a reminder that scars do not mark the end of beauty, but the beginning of a deeper, truer kind.